No biochar in there, is it?
No. That is one thing we want to look at, but it wasn't included in this. Yeah.
That's why you look at the nutrition, that's why.
Mm-hmm. So for the long-term production trial, like I said, this was more focused on the longevity of the containers. So what we were concerned with here was how the containers looked aesthetically and also how they stood up structurally. So, you know, some of these types do have some microbial growth and do break down somewhat during production. So we wanted to see how long some of these would last. So we actually grew 3 species, cyclamen, poinsettia, and gerbera, more long-term crops, for 16 weeks of culture and fertilized at a similar rate and same media type. But with this, we weren't necessarily as concerned with plant growth as we were the actual container. So what we did was we gave each container type an aesthetic rating and a structural rating at 12, 14, and 16 weeks. But what I'm just going to highlight today is 16-week ratings. And this is across all 3 species. So as you can see here, the different subcategories of containers are right here, and then the aesthetic rating and structural rating. The first one I want to note is the PHA with soy at 33. We did see some variability with those containers. There were some that broke down after about 6 weeks, and then there were some that lasted to 16 weeks. So there were some molding issues with that, and that was mainly probably due to how the material mixed when it was molded. We also did not test PHA with cellulose, and that was due to it basically cracked after about 2 weeks in the greenhouse. The containers did grow plants quite well, but they just didn't stand up. But a couple of the ones I wanted to look at here were the PLA composite with lignin. Again, like I'd mentioned, the one that basically performs similar to petroleum plastic. There was no downgrade in aesthetics or in structural ratings at all. So they did quite well. And that was also the case with PHA composites with both DDGs and starch. There was microbial growth in those containers, but you could not see it visually from the outside. You know, you could see it on the inside of the container when the plant was pulled out, but you could not see it through the sidewall. So there were some types that basically did not change at all visually and structurally over the 16 weeks. There's 2 more I wanted to note, which is the PLA composites with soy at 33% and the DDGs at 20%. There was a slight downgrade in the aesthetics with these 2 types, but overall the structure was quite good. They held up quite well. So even though there's some bleaching and things like that, which you'll see in this next slide, they still perform quite well. So here is a picture of some of the containers after 16 weeks of production, and some of these are actually back there on the table. PLA composites on the left, PHA composites in the middle, paper fiber there, and then the petroleum plastic control and polyamide and DDGs. Like I said, some of these actually bleached out. When they're new, they're more of a caramel color, and throughout production, they tend to lose that color and turn more of a whitish tan color almost. So you can see that there's a little bit of discoloration along the rim up there where the soil was, so that's what warranted those lower aesthetic ratings, but overall these stood up quite well. The 3 that I wanted to note here, again, were the PLA and lignin at 20%. It looked amazing. You know, like I said, they just didn't change over time, and neither did the starch and the DDGs at 20%. Now there is a lot of microbial growth, you just can't see it through the container. Fungi and bacteria. So
on the pot itself, or where is it something?
It's on the interface of where the media meets the pot. Okay. And sometimes the microbial growth does migrate into the soil a little bit, but it's nothing too severe. So a few types that I want to mention that didn't make it past 12 weeks. Like I said, was the PHA and soy on the right, but I'll talk about that here in a second. One of the interesting ones was the PLA soy and lignin. It had very good plant growth, but the material is really brittle right from the onset. The containers would snap quite easily. And basically after 4 weeks, you'd see cracking down the sidewalls. The container back there doesn't have it, but a majority of them did. It's kind of hard to see, but there is a crack forming right along there. The PHA and cellulose showed that after about 2 weeks. So that might have been a molding issue. We're not for sure. This cellulose material is now being blended with PLA, and we're going to do some tests with that here soon. We did see a beneficial fertilizer effect from those too. And then lastly, like I'd mentioned before, the PHA in soy began to fall apart after about 6 weeks. You can really see it here. If you look at the top of the container, it basically just fell apart, and I think that was mainly due to the migration of the soy polymer more to the top of the container and more PHA at the bottom. And then areas like this, it's almost like there was a concentration of that soy polymer and it didn't quite mix well, and it actually broke through the sidewall. So it looks pretty neat, but it just didn't quite perform the way we were hoping it would. And I'll also talk about we were hoping that we could still get a degradable container and still get a fertilizer release from the soy, but we did not see that, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So like I'd mentioned, we also conducted a greenhouse nursery production trial, or I'm sorry, not a greenhouse trial, but a nursery production trial with the same container types that you'd received. We grew Elijah Blue Fescue on the left, Rhodosier dogwood, and then back behind that is some white spruce. I didn't show a picture of those because they really didn't grow much. But overall, you can see that the plants grew great. There were really no differences. We did have a couple losses, but that was probably due to the plugs from the beginning maybe had some type of root rot, something like that. But overall, all the plants grew really great. I'm not going to show any data for these because everything was similar to the controls. One thing I do want to note, though, is the polyurethane coatings on the paper fibers. So, like I'd mentioned before, the reason why we did these coatings was to improve the structural integrity of these containers. And as you can tell on the left with the Rhodosier dogwoods, these two pictures, this container is coated and this container is uncoated. And this visually, aesthetics, this is not pleasing. It just doesn't look very good. But the coatings definitely helped out with that. There was a little bit of water soaking on the bottom where the holes were, but overall you didn't see this soaking all the way up the container like you did with the uncoated types. And if you look real close here, with the uncoated types, they're actually disintegrating around the holes. That bottom you could rip right off and it wouldn't be any issue. But with the coatings, it helped out tremendously. They stood up much better. One thing to note, though, is species differences. So this is a dogwood. It was kept much wetter than the Elijah Blue Fescue, which is a grass. So we didn't necessarily see the structure problems with that species, but aesthetically, the polyurethane coating definitely did help. So it helps with integrity for sure. So one of the issues that I was thinking about for the coatings was, yes, we put on 2 coats, but that's, putting on 2 coats is more labor intensive than 1. So I wanted to know whether or not you could get the same water use efficiency results with 1 coating as you would with 2. So this was, I tried this on both sizes, 4.5 inch and gallons. And water use efficiency is on the y-axis here. And as you can see, both 1 and 2 coats perform better than the uncoated control, but overall 2 coats was better than 1 coat. We didn't see quite the spread difference with gallons, and I think that's mainly due to the size of the container and the amount of media that they hold. So there's a little bit more flexibility of the plants using that water more efficiently. But overall, 2 coats perform better than 1. So last but not least, we've heard about this fertilizer effect of these soy containers and how much can it help out. So what we did was we did a modified feed nutrition trial where we fertilized, or where we grew 2 species, marigold and tomato. We grew them for 6 weeks in standard greenhouse conditions, and we administered 5 different fertilizer treatments. And based on some preliminary trials that we'd done the first year, we figured out that during the first couple weeks of production, you'd still have to supply these soy composites with a bit of fertilizer, but after that, they basically take over. So One of the fertilizer treatments was only feeding these plants for 2 weeks with 100 part per million nitrogen, and then discontinuing fertilization for 4 weeks. And then we went all the way up to a higher rate of 200 part per million nitrogen for the entire time for all containers. So as you can see here, there's a lot to take in. But overall, the container types are right here. So we have the petroleum control at the top with the various soy composites down below it. And then the fertilizer treatments are listed across the top, 1 through 5, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. So what I'm going to do, because there is a lot of different comparisons that you could make here, is I'm just going to compare a few container types and fertilizer treatments. So when you look at just the lowest feed rate right here, across all the different container types, we definitely saw the beneficial fertilizer release at that low rate. So the petroleum plastic containers produced plants that were somewhat chlorotic. They didn't grow in size. They did flower, which was kind of surprising to me, but overall they just did not look very healthy. But when you compare that to the soy PLA composites and Aspen's protein PLA, those plants were of great quality. They looked really good. So these were only fertilized for 2 weeks and then nothing for 4 weeks, which is pretty incredible. When you compare the petroleum control to soy PHA, we didn't see any benefit from the soy. And we think this is because of a carbon to nitrogen ratio of the material, but we don't know that for sure. We'd have to definitely do some tests with that. So at a lower feed rate, you see this big spread between the petroleum control and the soy composites, especially with PLA. But when you go to a higher fertilization rate, you don't really see quite the benefits that you would hope. The plants in the soy PLA composites were definitely a good size, but really, if you look at the control here in the breakdown, anything connected with the same letter is similar. And really the only differences were this container here, or that plant there and that plant there, which is slightly better. But overall, everything pretty much performed the same. So one interesting thing to note is more of a standard rate for marigolds, and this can be argued, you know, everyone has different fertilization requirements, things like that, but if you look at the petroleum plastic control fertilized for 6 weeks with 100 parts, and compare that to the soy composites only fertilized for 2 weeks with the same rate, 100 parts, some of the soy types were actually better. So it was pretty surprising. This goes to show that you can reduce your fertilizer applications by about 44% with the calculations that we've done. With tomatoes, which I'm not going to show here, it's up to 87%. So it's pretty incredible. What else do I want to mention here? Oh, and when you compare the petroleum control at that higher rate to soy PHA, again, we didn't see that fertilizer effect. Of the two materials of all the materials we tested here, the two that performed the best were the soy PLA at 50/50 and Aspen's protein PLA. And when you compare each fertilizer treatment and container type, there were really no differences. So at each fertilization rate, those containers all basically perform the same. And then again, like I'd mentioned, with the soy PHA, we were hoping that we could get a completely degradable container and still see that beneficial fertilizer release, but it wasn't apparent. So that just goes to show that that material is not going to make it to the next round. But there are others that do very well.